We're continuing on with our A Journey to Faith series, and tonight we're moving from one descendant to another descendant. So last week's lesson was called The Kinsman Redeemer, Boaz Marries Ruth. So we were looking at the book of Ruth last week, and this week we move on to his son, who's a little known name in the Bible. His name's called Obed, spelled O-B-E-D. And his story is situated in the period of Judges, following the return of Ruth back to Boaz and the marriage. And this, of course, is the son who becomes the father of Jesse, who becomes the father of David, or King David in the future. So we find that Obed's probably going to be the last person for quite some time now, as we're following the descendants through the genealogy of Jesus, who doesn't really have a story of his own in the Bible. So his story will be the story of Judges. What we do with people without their stories, we include the scripture where we can that's given in the Bible, and where there's not, we basically place them into the story of the Bible itself. So I'll give you some background information, and then basically we'll paint the picture of what life was like for Obed at that period of time. Getting underway, so a little bit of background for Obed. Obed is the son of Boaz, as we've mentioned, and Ruth, and he was born during the longest period of peace during the time of the Judges. His birth is recorded in the book of Ruth as the son who inherited the land of his mother's deceased husband through her what's known as a levirate marriage to a kinsman redeemer. I will explain this further. Whilst his life receives little fanfare in the Holy Bible, his birth is highly significant. Listed under the genealogy of David in Ruth chapter 4 verses 13 to 22, Obed is the offspring who links the descendants of Judah, known as the family line of Perez, which is in Ruth chapter 4 verse 18. So again, we've got the genealogy of David in Ruth chapter 4 verses 13 to 22, and we've got the family line of Perez in Ruth chapter 4 verse 18. So the proclamation that Obed will become the father of Jesse, who will become the father of David, from whom will come the Messiah, Jesus Christ. So we see the link up there to the genealogy of Jesus, the first verse. The name Obed means servant or worshipper. It proclaims his faithfulness and obedience to the Lord, attributes that will be tested throughout the duration of his life. So going back to just recapping a little bit on last week and a bit of new mixed with it, when Ruth married Mahlon in the land of Moab, so that's the son of Naomi, she accepted the God of Israel, his ways and his people, in place of their foreign god, who was called Shemosh. And so he was a Moabite god, and he's named in Jeremiah chapter 48 verses 7 and verse 13. When her husband died, she refused to return to her own family, their ways and their God. Instead, she chose to go with her mother-in-law Naomi to Bethlehem to live. When the promise she was entitled to receive through the covenant of marriage seemed to be all but lost, Boaz, her kinsman redeemer, stepped in and through marriage protected her and her mother-in-law during these difficult times. There was, however, another kinsman redeemer, much greater than Boaz, who opened her womb, and in Ruth chapter 4 verse 13 it says enabled her to conceive. So this is a point that we need to take notice of. So in other words, when Ruth came back with Naomi, she was without child. She didn't have any children. And so it says here, so we can see God's hand and God's plan happening here again, because the scripture here in Ruth 4 verse 13 says enabled her to conceive. So in other words, it was in God's timing that this was actually going to happen. And of course this is one of the forefathers of Jesus, and so we understand that God's hand is all over this genealogy and the passage of the descendants through time. And of course the person to conceive of course was Obed, as we're talking about. So giving birth to a son, she was now able to redeem the land that had been allotted to her deceased husband's family and pass on the inheritance from God's covenantal promise. So last week we talked about what a kinsman redeemer was, and a kinsman is somebody who is a bloodline relative, someone who's kin or next of kin, as we might say today. A redeemer, of course, is someone who redeems. It's someone who's actually going to make it happen or give it back to those who are going to make it happen. And so a kinsman redeemer in this situation is a relative who actually married Ruth in order that she could have a child, and those children would then take the inheritance of the land that would have otherwise been lost because of no children. So God was making sure through these laws that if somebody passed away through marriage to a brother or a near relative, that the first child would actually go to receive the inheritance of the deceased father, and thus by so doing making sure that the inheritance of the promised land from the covenant that God gave to each and every Israelite was actually fulfilled. And so in the giving birth to a son, so just telling a bit of the story now, so giving birth to a son, the women from the town of Bethlehem said to Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi, in Ruth chapter 4 verse 14 to 15, so we're right at the end of the book of Ruth this week. Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth. Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap to take care of him. When she did this, the woman said in Ruth chapter 4 verse 17, Naomi has a son. For just like the son she had lost, she now had a boy through whom her inheritance by marriage had actually been redeemed. So generationally she's been redeemed as well, because as a mother of 2 sons, she'd lost her husband and lost her 2 sons, and so the land that she actually enjoyed and lived on through her marriage was lost to her as well. So by the birth of Obed, that means that she too was redeemed, because they're now part of that same family line once again. So Ruth as the mother and Naomi as the grandmother are both now going to be kept and have a home, because they're no longer going to lose their land. So she no longer had any need to be bitter. You might remember last week we spoke about how she wanted to change her name because she was bitter at the circumstances which she found herself in returning from Moab. So the misfortune she had proclaimed had been brought upon her by the Lord in Ruth chapter 1 verse 20 to 21 had now been reversed. For she had been blessed with a descendant who would sustain her in her old age. And in Ruth 4:17 it simply says, and they named him Obed. So Obed is listed in genealogies from the book of Ruth, in Ruth chapter 4 verse 6, and the first book of Chronicles, 1 Chronicles chapter 2 verse 12, and also of course in the genealogy of Jesus in the book of Matthew, chapter 1 verse 5. Although his story in the Holy Bible only concerns the circumstances of his birth, he is placed as a descendant of Abraham's seed, from whom the Messiah, Jesus Christ, will come. So let's have a look at what events occurred throughout his life. So we're going to start putting some dates forward. I've actually dated the whole Bible, but I haven't been using the dates because they are circumstantial. The evidence is not complete for many of the dates, and so they're based on estimates and averages. But we're now just before Jesse, who's before King David, and all of the kings are actually dated very successfully. So we can use the Bible now to backtrack and actually place dates and ages on these people. So we're citing Obed's birth year as 1283 BC. Deborah, born the wife of Labadoth and a prophetess, had subdued Jabin the Canaanite king of Hazor, whilst Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, had killed Sisera, his commander. So last week we learnt that Deborah, who was a female judge or leader, or known as a prophetess, and we find now that she actually led them to this victory. As a consequence of the victory, they had 40 years of peace, and it's during this time that Obed was born into. So the period of famine also broke, because the Lord says in the scripture, and we mentioned this again in previous lessons, that he would actually inflict all sorts of punishments on his people if they were to worship foreign gods and foreign idols. And so he did. And so one of those consequences was famine in the land. And so at this point in time, the famine broke when Deborah overcame Sisera, and his father Boaz met and married his mother Ruth. So we're talking from Obed's point of view. So peace reigned throughout the territories of Israel. Throughout the life of Deborah, obedience and faith in the God of Israel returned to the land. Their faithfulness was rewarded with peace and prosperity. So by the time Obed had grown to the age of 38 in 1244 BC, Deborah passed away. And as was the way of the past, with her death, in Judges 6:1, it says the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. The power of the Midianites was so oppressive. So I'm reading now from Judges 6, verses 2 to 6. And it reads, "The power of the Midianites was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves and strongholds." So clearly they'd abandoned their dwellings in the cities and towns and villages. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza, and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count the men and their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. And so we learn with these people, it says they've come from the east, and they come from the Midianites, which is in the top of Saudi Arabia today. So these are people who are predominantly desert dwelling people, and hence the scripture tells us that they came with their camels. Okay, so they've invaded the land once Deborah has stopped ruling. So Obed, living where he lived, would have grown up on the land, just as his father and his father's father did. His day was mainly concerned with shepherding the livestock. Other people were employed to tend to the crops, the vineyards and the olive groves. He was also brought up in the way of the Lord by his father Boaz, just like his father Salmon before him. His father Boaz taught him the laws of God, and when he grew to the age of 12 and a half, he was considered a son of the law and became what is known as Gadol, which means he was considered an adult regarding his obligation to practice the commandments. So Obed remained by his elderly father's side until he was gathered to his people, meaning he passed away. He then would have taken responsibility as the head of the family. Obed took great care of his grandmother Naomi and mother Ruth, and the scriptures tell us that they relied on him. And so we can know from this that he took care of them. Naomi doted on him, but she passed away soon after Boaz. You can imagine this. You know, she had lost everything. She'd lost a son, she'd lost a husband. She came back, she didn't remarry, and so she was pretty desperate. And suddenly when Obed was born, she had land again. They returned the land that she'd always known, and she had security because it became Obed's responsibility to take care of the women. And so you can imagine she'd be completely reliant on Obed, and so she would have doted on him as a grandson. But she passed away, of course, just like Boaz had. So Obed loved his mother Ruth deeply, but eventually she too would have grown old and passed away. So we see a whole 2 generations move on. So Obed was happy and content because he's living in a period of time of peace and prosperity. Life would have had a steady cycle of familiarity until one day messengers passed through the town and brought news that Deborah too had passed away, the judge. He would have been full of trepidation, for he had been told of the sickening oppression that his father had survived when he grew up under King Eglon of Moab, and later in the elderly years under the Canaanite king Jabin of Hazor. His father Boaz had told him how every time a leader or a judge passed away, that his people soon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so the Bible repeats this cycle whereby whenever a leader passes away, that people fall away from the Lord and start to worship foreign gods and allow the invaders from other nations to influence their lives. So moral decay, in essence, began to set in. People stopped their tithes and offerings to the Lord. Some of the men in town married outside of their own people, and before long altars were being built in the high places to the Baals and the Ashtoreths. It seemed that as soon as they chose new gods, war came to the city gates. And so we read from Judges chapter 5 verse 8, it actually says this, that people chose new gods, war came to the city gates. And so we find in the book of Judges that every time a judge passed away, that those who came in went to war against God's people. The hard part to understand here is probably the fact that God actually said that he would bring foreign leaders against his own people. He said if they were disobedient and they didn't worship him and none other, then he would bring pestilence, disease, drought, war. He would do the whole lot to them. And so we find this recurrence during the book of Judges. And of course Obed now, the next generation, is actually living from going from a time of peace and prosperity into a time now where things are all going to go pear-shaped again. So early in this year, the rains had been and the barley crop was due for harvest, but just as they began to harvest the barley, a vast number of foreign men entered Bethlehem on their camels. There were men from the east, mainly Midianites, but they were also accompanied by a smaller number of Amalekites and other people from places they did not know. They did not pass through, nor did they take over the town, but rather they moved out onto the fields and pasture lands and pitched their tents. Obed was outside of town when they came. He had been out checking on his herds and flocks. He could hear the commotion, foreign men yelling in a foreign language. The women were screaming and he could hear the sound of fighting, so he dared not return. So the Bible tells us that when these people came with the camels, they didn't go and inhabit the towns. You may think that's peculiar, but if you actually think about whom they are, they're actually transient tent people, like Bedouin Arabs today. So for them it was normal to live outside of towns, and so they would have sought the land to pitch their tents. And so when they arrived and they fought against these people, they destroyed their towns and they didn't live in them. They remained in their tents, so that once they'd, I guess, feasted on everything they wanted, they would just move on to the next location. And so knowing that Obed would have been tending his flocks every day, he would have been predominantly outside of town most of the time. And we know that Obed actually survived because the Bible tells us so. And so he mustn't have been in the town when they invaded. And hence this is how I piece together the story of Obed. So staying out of town, Obed stayed with his flocks and herds and found shelter in a limestone cave that was so abundant in the hills. Having been to Bethlehem, the hill country there is full of limestone caves. It's full of limestone blocks everywhere, so it's not very hard to imagine that he would have plenty of places to actually hide. The Bible tells us that the people actually hid in the caves and the crevices, etc. So we know that he must have done so as well. As I said, as a young boy, he had shepherded the livestock and was used to staying out days at a time. He would have laid low until he felt it was safe to return, but because they never went away, the days would have turned into weeks and the weeks would have turned into months. The season finally began to turn and the cold set in. Obed would occasionally come in closer, as you can imagine, to have a look at the town to see what was going on and see whether it was safe to return, until one morning, the cool of the day, he would have approached and found to his surprise that they'd all finally gone. He would have gone into the town and passed through his fields, and everything would have been devastated. The tilled fields prepared to lie fallow for the winter would have been trampled flat and returned to weed because of the camps of the foreign invaders. The vineyards and the olive trees were damaged and broken, so Obed would have made his way into town and be shocked to find that all the livestock had also been killed. Nothing had been spared, not the sheep, nor the cattle, or even the donkeys. Now again, I'm painting a picture as a story, but the Bible tells us that these people killed all these things, lived outside of the towns, and devastated all the crops. And so there's no assumption in this story, we're just placing Obed into what was occurring at the time. So it was a sad day. Many of the people Obed had grown up with would have been dead or missing. As the early morning passed, the townsfolk that was there, they would have come out and met him at the town gate where they always met. And they would have been shocked to see him because he hadn't been there for a long time, and they would have probably believed that he was dead. It had been so long since they had seen him, his return would have been a real blessing, for the livestock that he had kept out in the hills would have now been able to be used to provide for the people who had remained behind. They set about rebuilding. Travellers gradually started passing through again and told of how these raiders were all over the land of Israel. Their number so great that they were considered, as the Bible tells us, like locusts on the land. This news made the people of Bethlehem realise that the Midianites and other eastern tribes hadn't left the nation of Israel, but had just simply moved on looking for a new source of provision. Obed and his people went out into the hill country away from their town and the highway, and as it says in Judges 6:2, they sought mountain clefts, caves and strongholds once again. They did, however, still need to grow food, so they would have went about preparing their fields, their vineyards and their olive groves for the new season. But the Midianites returned again and again. In Judges 6:4 it says they camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza. So today Bethlehem is about 16 kilometres south of Jerusalem in the hill country, and the Gaza is obviously at the bottom of Israel, so you can get a picture of that territory. This went on, the Bible tells us, for 7 years, until in Judges 6:6 it says Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord. He sent them a prophet. He told them that even though God had rescued them from Egyptian slavery and given them their land, that they had not listened when he said, and in Judges chapter 6 verse 10 it reads, "I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live." An angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah, belonging to Joash the Abiezrite. He had a son called Gideon. Now Ophrah is actually in the tribal area of West Manasseh. I'm going to show you a map in a moment, and it's actually not far from the coast, and it's actually a place which was close to Megiddo and close to Mount Carmel in Israel today. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said in Judges 6 verse 12, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "But sir," Gideon replied, and this is in Judges 6:13, "if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his workers that our fathers told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and put us into the hand of Midian." The Lord said to them in verse 16, "I will be with you, and you will strike down the Midianites altogether." But Gideon was sceptical. He placed his worthiness at the lowest level. He didn't believe he could save Israel. He said his clan was the weakest in Manasseh, and that he was the least in his family, and that's written about in Judges 6 verse 15. So he asked the Lord to give him a sign to prove that it was really him that he was talking to. The Lord agreed, and Gideon prepared an offering of goat meat in a broth accompanied by bread. He took them out to the angel of God, who said to him in Judges 6 verse 20, "Take the meat and the unleavened bread, place them on this rock, and pour out the broth. This Gideon did. The angels touched the meat and bread with a staff that was in his hand. Fire consumed them, and the angel disappeared. Gideon now truly understood that he had been talking with an angel and built an altar to the Lord there. So before I go any further, I'm just going to put up a map for you to have a look at. So this will be held up for those of you who are on Facebook, and for those of you who are on Zoom, I'm just going to bring that picture up for you to have a look at. Okay. So if you have a look at this map, one moment. If you have a look at this map, you can see there the area that shows where Gideon, the fourth judge, would be in the tribe of Manasseh. You can also see on there the position of where Bethlehem is, and you can see where Gaza is further south that I've mentioned, where the Philistines live. You can take note by looking at that East and West Manasseh are actually, Manasseh are separated on either side, as we learnt in previous lessons, and Ephraim, which is the tribe underneath them, was where Deborah had actually been living as the previous judge. And so we find that the judges in Israel, and I will put up more maps as we go, you'll see that they're not all just from one place, they're actually located from all different tribes all over the land of Israel, and they were chosen by God not because of their location, but because of whom they were as a person. Okay, so carrying on, it needs to be understood that Gideon's family and the people of his town had turned away from the Lord. They were worshipping both Baal and Asherah, the god and goddess worshipped together by the Amorites who had lived there before them. This disgusted the Lord, for not only had these people walked away from him, but they practiced temple prostitution. They burnt their own children as sacrifices, and their priests self-mutilated themselves with knives and daggers. No wonder Gideon sought to test the Lord's angel. With so much evil around him, he wanted to be sure. That night the Lord said to Gideon, we're reading from Judges chapter 6 now, verse 25 to 26. The Lord said to Gideon, take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old. Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on top of this height. Using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer the second bull as a burnt offering. Gideon was afraid. So he took 10 of his servants and did what the Lord asked during the same night. In the morning, when the men of the town saw what had been done, they found out that Gideon did it and demanded he be killed. But Gideon's father Joash stood up to them and suggested that if Baal was a real god, he should be able to defend himself. Gideon's actions and that of his father became a turning point. They faced those around them and stood for the Lord. Whilst this was happening, the Midianites, Amalekites and other eastern peoples joined their armies together and crossed the Jordan River. After crossing the river, they made their way westwards and settled down to camp in the Jezreel Valley, not far from Ophrah, where Gideon was living. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet to summon a people called the Abiezrites. I'll spell that Abiezrites, Abiezrites, the people from his town. He asked them to stand with him against their oppressors. He also sent out messengers throughout the territories allocated to Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun and Naphtali to call the men to arms. But despite all of this, Gideon's faith and trust in the Lord was still weak. He asked God to overcome 2 more tests of proof. First a fleece wet with dew while the ground was dry, and then a dry fleece while the ground was wet with dew. God fulfilled both of them on 2 successive nights, and Gideon was finally filled with faith. Obviously these tests are contra to what would naturally happen in the natural. And so he knew that this was something of God because it wouldn't be possible otherwise. And so we can see that even after that first stage that happened, like many in the Bible, people still need more time and more convincing that it's actually God that's doing what's happening rather than some other means. So he asked, so early the next morning, Gideon and the men from their 4 Israelite tribes camped at the spring of Harod. The Midianites were to the north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. Now I'm going to put up another map, and again these will be put up on the YouTube video after it's produced, but we'll hold these up. We'll hold these up for Facebook, and again I'll pop them up for Zoom, so that you can have a look at those locations that we're talking about. So there's instructions on the map. You'll see as you're having a look at it. Sorry, I just popped this one up on for Zoom. Okay. And so we have a look at this one. You can see up at the top there, up towards the Sea of Galilee, all of the different arrows that are actually painting the picture of where all the different people come from that are going to be involved in this conflict. So from the other side, the western side, the eastern side of the Jordan River, we have tribes of people who went across to join the fight. On the eastern side, we have those from those tribes that we just mentioned who joined together also to join in this fight. Now this fight, the location of it is actually in the Jezreel Valley, and Harod is actually very close to Beit Shean near the Jordan River. And so this is a place where we have mountains on one side, mountains on the other side, and then we have the valley in the middle. And so this is obviously a place where the relevant armies can oppose each other, see each other, and then come and meet one another as they fight on the plains down below. So the assembled Israelites numbered 32,000, the Bible tells us. And in Judges 7:2, it says, "In order that Israel may not boast against me, that her own strength has saved her, God reduced their number all the way down to just 300. What this does for us is it says the assembled Israelites numbered 32,000, so it gives us a picture of how many people there are as well. You might remember during the time of Deborah there was 40,000 men who could actually fight. These assembled Israelites are only from a few of the northern tribes. And so we can see they've grown in number over those 40 years considerably, because there's now 32,000 men, but they're only from the tribes in the north. So God didn't want them, however, to win this battle by showing that it was by their strength. God wanted them to understand that it was actually He who was actually going to win this victory for them. And so He tells them to reduce their numbers just down to 300 only. That evening the 300 men followed the instructions of the Lord, and they surrounded the camp of the Midianites. And in Judges chapter 7 verse 19 it says, "At the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guard," so this means just after midnight, "and after blowing 300 trumpets, they broke glass jars that contained their torches. With the air reaching the smouldering ends of their torches, the flames burst into activity, and they shouted," in verse 20, "a sword for the Lord and for Gideon." The Lord caused most of the men in the camp to turn on each other with their swords, whilst those that fled were pursued, caught and killed. And so we can see again, the Lord goes ahead. It's my Lord is the banner. My Lord the banner. Right? Yahweh Nissi. He will go before His people and He will win those battles for you. And so in this story we hear that this is what happens once again. So with the success of battle, the Israelites said to Gideon in Judges chapter 8, verse 22 to 23, "Rule over us, you, your son and your grandson, because you have saved us out of the hand of Midian." But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." And so we learn in this part of the Bible that God has won the victory, and He wants people to see that it's actually Himself who's actually won this victory. And so When it comes to time for a leader to be chosen, Gideon makes it clear that he wants the Lord to actually be their leader. We can see what happens when people lead. We find that human sin nature has an effect, and we have this constant cycle of devastation in the Bible. Unfortunately, this was to become a trap for Gideon, for the people of Israel would come to prostitute themselves to it there, worshipping it as an idol. So once again, as soon as they form something that's not of God, people begin to worship it. The Midianites were subdued before the Israelites by the Lord and did not raise their hand against God's people again. For the rest of Gideon's lifetime, the land enjoyed peace for the next 40 years. Obed had survived in the hills around Bethlehem now for 7 years. It was in this year, in 1238 BC, that Obed and his people had been praying in earnest and had cried out to the Lord for help. You may wonder how I'm arriving at these dates, but the Bible tells us how many years it happens between each of the judges and each of the periods of time of the rulers. So once we establish one date, we can actually track backwards and forwards and actually place dates on all of the events that actually happen. And so this is what's happening here now. So messengers who had learned to make their way throughout Israel without travelling on the main highways came from time to time and gave them news of events throughout the territories of Israel. It was in this same year that news was brought to Obed that the Midianites, who had been oppressing them under the authority of their kings, Zebah and Zalmunna. So Judges chapter 8 verse 5 has their names. Again, Zebah, Z-E-B-A-H, and Zalmunna, Z-A-L-M-U-N-N-A. Judges chapter 8 verse 5. They had amassed a huge army with the help of the Amalekites and some other eastern peoples. Hearing that this army had made camp in the Jezreel Valley, so again in the same location as the previous battle, the messenger told of a new leader called Gideon, who had been raised up to defeat this immense enemy of his people. The news was worrying though, for the messenger conveyed the sheer size of the Midianite forces and their camels. He said they were so numerous, and it reads in Judges 7 verse 12, that the Midianites, the Amalekites and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Now I've been there. That's an incredible number of people and locusts. I mean, we're talking, I think about, I'm not sure how many kilometres. It'd be 30 odd kilometres from the coast to the Jordan River perhaps. It would be several kilometres across, and so you can imagine if that was filled with people and camels from one end to the other, that would be an incredible sized army. And it says here that they were as thick as locusts. And it also reads, their camels could no longer be counted than the sand on the seashore. So we're talking about very large numbers. He also related how Gideon had been able to assemble a force from the tribes of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun and Naphtali. But his prognosis was not good, for he said they were ill-equipped and only a quarter of the size of the eastern forces. Obed fed the messenger, and after a good night's rest he headed further south towards Hebron. It was only 2 days later yet another messenger passed through. His demeanour was different to that of anyone Obed had seen for quite some time. As he approached, his countenance was radiant and he was bursting with news of a great victory. So you have to understand this story that Obed is in Bethlehem, and we're talking about Gideon, who's up in the north. And so those tribes that were down south, they actually never fought in these battles, but they would have had messengers coming down and telling them what was actually going on. So the first messenger would have come down and told them how dire things were because of this valley filled with camels greater than the what does it say? Greater than the sand. And so we find that would have been horrific news. And then of course the next messenger comes down and they learn that they'd actually won this battle against them. And so Obed, as a person and the southern part of Israel, is not actually involved in this fight. So he explained how during the previous night Gideon had routed a much larger army with only 300 soldiers. So we're just recounting the personal story now. When he retold the story of the sound of the trumpets, Obed knew straight away But the hand of the Lord had brought about this victory. He gave thanks, again feeding the messenger as he had the last. Obed left as soon as the meal was finished. He was determined to return to his home in Bethlehem and start over. So at this point in time, Obed would still been a youthful teenager. He would have been a strong and determined... I beg your pardon. Obed was not a youthful teenager, I should say. He was a strong and determined man. He would have been aged about 44 years of age, as with his father before him and his father's father before him. Obed was able to rebuild and live a prosperous life, for the Lord's blessing was his to receive. Once again, peace had returned to the land of Israel. So we see that Obed was born in the time of peace. He went through this 7 years of oppression, he went through this battle, and then once again peace returned to the land. So Gideon went back home to live. He married many wives, the Bible tells us. He fathered 70 sons. So he was a busy man. He also had a concubine who lived in Shechem, who bore a son who he named Abimelech. And we head now into another story of the Bible where this becomes a problem. So after 40 years of peace, Gideon died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb with his father Joash in Ophrah. But as with those who had led Israel before him, as soon as he was gathered to his people, the Israelites once again prostituted themselves to Baal. They set up a god known as Baal-berith and forgot the Lord their God. Now Baal-berith actually means Lord of the Covenant, and it originated in Shechem. Jewish tradition says this idol was in the shape of a fly and identical to Baal-zebub, the Lord of the Flies, and was named such because the people made a covenant of devotion to this idol where they would carry an image of it in their pockets, and unwilling to part with it for a moment, they would often take it out and they'd actually kiss it. So this is a very bizarre tradition which we see happening, but people do strange things with idols. They also were unkind to Gideon's family, even though he had done so many good things to them. So Abimelech, born a son to Gideon by a concubine in Shechem, had no intention of respecting his father's wishes when he said in Judges chapter 8 verse 23, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you, the Lord will rule over you." He went to his brothers in Shechem and said in Judges chapter 9 verse 2, "Ask all the citizens of Shechem, which is better for you, to have all 70 of Jerubaal's that's the name given to Gideon when he destroyed the altar to Baal. It means let Baal contend with him. And so he was actually given this name called Jerubbaal, so it's actually Gideon himself. It says, "Sons rule over you, or just one man." So he had 70 sons, as we said, so they had a choice. 70 sons to rule over you, or just one man. "Remember, I am your flesh and blood." Identifying with him as their brother, they were leaning towards following him and gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal-berith. But Abimelech turned against them. He said in Judges 9:4, he hired reckless adventurers who became his followers and went to the family home in Ophrah and murdered all but one of the 70 brothers. The youngest son, Jotham, escaped by hiding. And so we can see the chaos that's going on here. Abimelech was crowned king, and in Judges 9:6 it says, "Beside the great tree at the pillar in Shechem. And Jotham, shouting down from the top of Mount Gerizim, said to the citizens of Shechem," in Judges 9 verses 19 to 20, "If then you have acted honourably and in good faith toward Jerubbaal and his family today, may Abimelech be your joy, and may you be his too. But if you have not, let fire come out from Abimelech and consume you, citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo, and consume Abimelech." Jotham here exercised the law of blessing and curse originally given to Abraham in Genesis 12 verse 3, which says, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse." Abimelech did evil in the sight of the Lord, killing virtually all of Gideon's sons. He sought to rule over the Israelites in defiance to his father and to the Lord. And so this story paints this picture of how through one son, through another woman, stepping outside the covenant of marriage and intermarrying with yet another person, disaster actually struck, and all but one son was killed as a result. So Jotham fled and lived in Beer, the Bible says, and that's understood to be Beersheba on the southern border of Judah. At this point in time, we now travel down to 1199 BC. Obed had worked hard and been blessed with prosperity now for 40 years since the Midianites had been defeated. Although Gideon did not rule over Israel, his deeds that led to the Israelites overcoming the Midianites were remembered, and the mighty power of God that caused it to happen stayed with this generation. They had led a peaceful life, faithful to the God of Israel. Excuse me. Now the news of Gideon's death soon spread throughout Israel, and as if the people were somehow released from an obligation to worship the God of Israel, the people once again began to worship Baal in its many different forms. One in particular was lifted up, and they called it Baal Berith, as I mentioned, and it had the appearance of a fly. They re-established the altars, and the worship of this fly took hold faster because of the youth. They thought it was a bit of fun, and they were more susceptible. So even though their parents had told them of the mighty power of the God of Israel, the children decided not to listen. Now aged 83, Obed was very concerned and anxious, for he had seen what happened before when his generation had been severely punished for walking away from the Lord. Living in Bethlehem, which was situated along the highway called the Way to Shur, meant that news from throughout the nation of Israel and elsewhere would be heard soon after any of the events happened. Gathering at the gates to the town, Obed and the other elders saw a distressed young man come hurriedly down from the north. Greeting him, they learnt that he was Jotham, the youngest son of Gideon, whom they had been mourning. Asking him why he was there and why he was in such a hurry, he told them of how his half-brother, a man called Abimelech, who lived in Shechem, had come with some followers and murdered all of his brothers on the same stone, and then proclaimed himself king over the citizens of Shechem. That's from Judges 9 verses 4 to 6. He went on to explain how Baal-berith had originated from Shechem, where this Abimelech had been born to his father's slave girl, and that comes from Judges 9 verse 18. So Jotham was fearful of Abimelech and sought to distance himself in a place less known. The families of Bethlehem fed him and provided him with some provision. For their kindness, Jotham bid them farewell and continued to head southwards. So I've got another map here for this period of events, which we'll just hold up again for those of you watching on Facebook. Again, it'll be put onto YouTube. It just shows these locations and the direction that was actually travelled. I'll just pop this up onto the Zoom as well. So you can see there how the events took place up at Ophrah, up next to the Jezreel Valley there, and of course the highway to Shur is highlighted with the arrow, so you can see them travelling south. They would have passed by Jerusalem, then Bethlehem, then Hebron, and he would have made his way down to Beer, as it was called, which is understood to be Beersheba as we know it today. So Jotham's half-brother, Abimelech, governed Israel for 3 years, the Bible tells us. In Judges chapter 9 verses 22 to 24 it reads, "After Abimelech had governed Israel for 3 years, God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the citizens of Shechem, who acted treacherously against Abimelech. God did this in order that the crime against Jerubbaal, meaning Gideon's 70 sons, the shedding of their blood, might be avenged on their brother Abimelech and on the citizens of Shechem who had helped him murder his brothers. Consequently, the citizens of Shechem put men on top of the surrounding hills, from where they would rush down and ambush anyone who passed by either to or from Shechem, and this was reported to Abimelech. During this time, a person called Gaal, son of Ebed, spelled G-A-A-L, in Judges 9 verse 26 says, moved with his brothers into Shechem, and its citizens put their confidence in him. There's no specific information concerning where he came from in the Bible, but if he was not overcome by the Shechemites, who were ambushing everyone, he and his brothers must have been a force to reckon with. His name, Gal, son of Ebed, means loathing son of a slave. So there's a name for you from the Bible. So again, Gal means loathing son of a slave. And it is thought that he was probably a Canaanite chief with his own soldiers and brothers who set out on marauding raids against other peoples and towns. The people of Shechem went out to the fields to harvest grapes. They trod on the grapes to crush them and extract the juice, and a festival was held in the temple dedicated to this Baal Berith, this fly, where the people ate and drank. During their celebratory festivities to honour their alliance with Gal, son of Ebed, God sent the evil spirit that manifested itself, causing these Shechemites to curse Abimelech. Seizing on this sentiment, Gal, son of Ebed, questioned their loyalty to Abimelech and proclaimed that if they were loyal to him, he would get rid of Abimelech. So we can see a plan in place to get rid of Abimelech now. So Zebul, who was the governor of Shechem, I'm sorry, there's a lot of names here, they're all from the Bible, but you can probably picture what's happening. There's a revolt within a revolt happening that's unstable. So Zebul, the governor of Shechem, heard of this and sent word to Abimelech that he should come there in the night and lay in wait in the fields outside the town until sunrise, and then advance against Gal and his men. Abimelech did just that. He brought all of his troops, and when he advanced in the morning, Gal, his men, and those who supported him from Shechem went out to fight. Abimelech overcame them, they fled, and many were killed. Those who made it back to the city gates were repelled by Zebul, and they were driven out of Shechem. Abimelech stayed in a place called Arumah. Abimelech then sat on the throne that his father had refused. He was raised up unjustly by the Shechemites, and now they would feel the weight of his power. The next day, when the Shechemites went out into the fields, he struck again. He captured and destroyed the city and killed its people, but some people in the tower of Shechem survived this, and it says in Judges 9 verse 46 that they went into what's called the stronghold of the temple of El Berith. So Berith is that fly, El means God. So they're worshipping this Baal or Lord or God, this fly, and they have built a temple to it. So Abimelech had his men chop wood and place it around the base of the tower and set fire to it. And in Judges 9 verse 49 it says, about 1,000 men and women also died. Abimelech then went to a place called Thebez, Thebez, besieged it and captured it, but there was a tower inside where all the city people fled. Locking themselves in, they climbed up to the tower's roof, and when Abimelech went to storm it, he set out to burn it as he had done at Shechem. But as he approached, in Judges chapter 9 verse 53, it says, a woman dropped an upper millstone on his head and cracked his skull. So I have a picture, one's an illustration of this, to sort of set the scene. Another one's an actual picture of a millstone. There is different sizes, so we'll just hold these up for you. Sorry. I'll just put this pictures up on Zoom as well. So we're almost towards the end of tonight's lesson. And so if you look at that picture, you see the illustration of the woman holding the millstone up above her head. It's a smaller one, but if you look at the picture beneath it, you'll see that there's a donkey with a large millstone, and that photo was actually taken in Nazareth in Israel. And you can see that it's a substantial stone, but the reason I put the picture there is to show you what a millstone actually does. It's used in a mill. The grain is put into the base, and then it's actually spun around in a circle as the wheel goes around, and it crushes the husk of the grain to retrieve the flour that's inside. And so the picture of all of that is that you can imagine that this is a very heavy object, and if someone was able to hoist one that's not even such a big size up in the air and drop it on one's head from a great height, then it's obviously going to crack your skull. So there's a picture there just to help you understand. what that was like. Okay, so terribly injured, the Bible tells us that Abimelech called his servant the armour bearer and told him to kill him with his sword so that his reputation wouldn't be sullied by being remembered as the leader who was killed by a woman. God has a sense of humour, the Bible has a sense of humour. So this leader decided he would kill himself rather than be known to die from this millstone thrown on his head by a woman. So with Abimelech dead, the fighting actually ceased. God had repaid the wickedness of Abimelech and the Shechemites. The curse of Jotham, son of Gideon, had come to pass. So Abimelech's localised rule had little impact on Obed in Bethlehem. In 1197 BC, a person called Tola, T-O-L-A, son of Puah, spelt P-U-A-H, from the tribe of Issachar, led Israel for the next 23 years. But there was actually no peace in the land. The people were fractured, the confederation of tribes was weak, and the curse of worshipping foreign gods was still a problem. In Judges chapter 10, verse 1 to 2, it says, "He lived in Shamir, in the hill country of Ephraim. He led Israel for 23 years, then he died, and he was buried in Shamir." So I've got one last picture for you here, and this picture is actually a picture which shows you all of the different tribes of Israel, but on there it places the locations for all of the judges so far that we've spoken about in the Bible. So I'm just going to hold that up for the Facebook there again, and I'm just going to pop that up onto Zoom to see. And so you can see there that there's these different locations. So the first judge was Othniel, who was actually the son of Caleb, of Jephunneh. He was one of the two spies that went into the land of Canaan before the Israelites went. And so Othniel became the first judge. The second judge was called Ehud, and he's from the tribe of Benjamin, which of course butts onto the top of Jerusalem today. The third judge is Deborah, and she was from the tribe of Ephraim, which is slightly north of that again. And then the fifth judge is the fourth judge was Gideon, who is up in the tribe of Manasseh. So he's up in the Jezreel Valley towards the top of the tribe of West Manasseh. Now the fifth judge is this judge called Tola, and he comes from the tribe of Issachar, and so you see his location is up there near the top of Ephraim. And there's another picture that's on there which is to the to your right, and that's the sixth judge who we haven't got to yet, and his name's called Jair, and he's from the tribe of Gad. And so you can see that these leaders were from all over the land. They weren't just from one location, and they weren't just descendants of the same family. They were actually leaders who were called because God saw fit that they were actually righteous people, and they were the right people to lead his people. And so hopefully that map that you see, which again will be placed on the video on YouTube, will help you to get a picture of what's actually going on. It's a difficult part of the Bible, there's a lot going on, but I find that doing these maps and preparing them myself helps me to understand what was going on and to place them in the land, and it helps us to get a better picture and bring to life the story of the Bible. So in the latter part of Tola's leadership, Eli, who will become the high priest of Israel and bring up the prophet Samuel in the Lord's house, was born in a place called Shiloh. And this is determined from the book of Samuel, so 1 Samuel chapter 4 verse 15. Again, 1 Samuel chapter 4 verse 15, which tells us that Eli died at the age of 98 when the Ark of the Covenant is later captured by the Philistines. So we're very much moving into a time in the Bible where it's easier to date and put information together. And so you can see we're starting to move into a territory now at the end of Obed's life and the beginning of Jesse's, where we start to hear names that we're very familiar with in the Bible. And so we enter into this time. In 1175 BC, Jair, the other judge which was on that map, the sixth one, of Gilead, became the next leader of Israel for 22 years, the Bible tells us. The land of Israel, however, was still infected with the worship of foreign gods. Although wealthy and powerful with many sons, Jair was more like a regional monarch. Gideon was the last judge who actually ruled over all of Israel. So take notice of that. When we read the Bible, we often go in sequences or series, so we expect that we go from one to the next to the next. But we find in this particular situation that there's those who led all of Israel and there's those who were like regional judges, because there were still things going wrong in other parts of Israel. And so this is that particular point where I've stated that Gideon was the last judge who ruled over all of Israel, and this affects the Bible in the future. So for example, during the time of Samuel and Samson, they seem to have two separate stories in the Bible, because the books of the Samuel are divided into 1 and 2. In the Hebrew Bible, they're not separate books, they're just for the same book. And their stories actually happen during the period of time of the Philistines' rule, which was over 40 years. And the Bible tells us that each of those leaders led for 20 years each. And so they actually lived at the same time, but they lived in different places. And so we start to picture this complex part of the Bible of Judges, that there's actually more than one thing going on at one time, and this is part of what makes it a little bit difficult to follow. But it also sows into the fact that there was a period of chaos, and the Bible makes it clear that that was so. So from Judges chapter 10 verse 4 to 5, it says that Jair of Gilead, it says he had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys. They controlled 30 towns in Gilead, which to this day are called Havoth Jair, which means the settlements of Jair. When Jair died, he was buried in a place called Camon. And so it tells us quite clearly there that with all of his sons, they only ruled over a specific area of Israel. So at this point in time, by dating, Obed would have now been aged 126 years of age. During this time, like many of his forefathers, Obed had married a woman much younger than he and fathered a son. They named him Jesse. The name Jesse means God's gift. This is David's father, King David's father. His name means God's gift. Hardly surprising under the circumstances. And Obed was gathered to his people. And so this lesson, I'm just about to draw it to a close. It is a slightly longer one, but you can sort of see it's a little bit hard to break it up, because Obed's journey is across a period of time of several judges, and he's alive, and you can see the circumstances which are going to lead up to the birth of Jesse, the father of David. So to finish off, it says, although the nation of Israel still worshipped foreign gods, the much reduced population of Israelites had recovered and grown immensely. Obed's life had been significantly better than those before him, for with the exception of the 7-year period under the rule of the Midianites, Amalekites and other eastern peoples, his time had been mostly under the judges of Israel. So next week we're going to see what happens when Jesse is born. Traditionally, when we read about Jesse, we read about him as the father of David, and that's what his story is. But Jesse has a life too, and he has a story, and he lived during a period of time of judges before David, and his story comes into the Bible. And so next week we're going to explore that. We're going to unpack the scriptures and Judges around that period of time, and you'll get to learn a lot more, I guess, complicated and convoluted detail about the Bible. It is complicated, but I hope that this lesson has helped you. You can play it back on Facebook to listen to it again, and again it'll be put up on YouTube as a lesson. All of the maps and the pictures will be added to it for you to enjoy, and you can pause it and have a look at them. You can read your Bible and check the references. So I'm going to sign off online at this point in time. Thank you for joining us. I pray that you are safe at this point in time with the COVID-19 that's going on around the world, and I pray God's blessing upon you until next time. Good night.
Can you